Okay, we are going to talk about perceiving the auditory scene today. This is working the way I expect it to, but we shall see. So this is that part of sound, of organizing, of how we organize sound. And the questions that apply here, the major question is, how do we decide which of those frequency components belong together to form each separate sound? Because if you remember, we are separating the stimuli produced by each of these sources in a scene into a separate perception. But what's happening with those notes, with those harmonics, is that if the man is playing an A on the guitar and the woman is singing an A and the man is playing an A on the piano, that's basically just an overlap of that fundamental frequency. Let's say it's the 220A, those harmonics of 220, 440, 660, and 880, and they're all overlapped on top of each other as far as what's happening at the level of the basilar membrane. So how do we decide which frequency components belong together to form each of those separate sounds? How do we segregate those sounds? And just to kind of make sure some of what I'm saying relates back to how you remember these harmonics working. So as you remember, Goldstein used 200 just to keep things kind of simple. And if we look at so he's showing here 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, and we have higher harmonics as well that typically get kind of ignored. But you can see that they're going to be overlapping. What happens typically is that lowest harmonic, or really the lowest frequency or the fundamental frequency, that's the frequency that we are hearing. And the rest of them are multiples of that, in this case, 200 hertz. And then that should say 200 hertz. But so, and then we get to those multiples being, they're each at their own amplitude. So the guitar has the same multiples, but at different amplitudes than the bassoon, which has the same multiples, 400, 600, 800, etc., but each at their own amplitude, and so forth. And so if we are spreading out, and so we take that basilar membrane that looks up into that shell, and then we spread it out flat, like I did on the one picture, we can see that we're going to see this vibration, these maximal points of displacement at, and this one uses 220 because actually it's an actual, or no, I'm sorry, this one uses 440 because that's an actual note or tone. So 440 is a higher A. Its multiples are going to be 880, 1320, and so forth. And again, when I'm playing that on these different instruments, we're going to have those same harmonics. And so it's just overlapping. And the fact that we can hear these as three separate instruments, if we go to our back to our picture of we can segregate these various differences in timbre, it's really quite incredible. So I have this as a blue question to really have you think about it, and I do want you to think about how is this happening. And we're actually going to come to some repeating. So if you pause here before going on into the principles of auditory grouping, it's a good place to pause and go back to the objects and scenes chapter and to those notes and look at those Gestalt principles, because we're going to see a real overlap. Remember that vision is giving us that specificity in space. We are creatures that live in space and time. The sound information is giving us more specificity in time than in space, right? If we can find that, we can hear approximately where that bird is, but we have to find it with our eyes. But sound gives us more precise information about timing. So some of our principles of auditory grouping, one is onset time. Sounds that start at different times likely come from different sources. And if you remember, so even if we all started playing or singing that A at the same time with my guitar, my singer, and my piano player, there's going to be some slight variance there. And remember that our ears, I think I said in one of the previous slideshows, our ears can, to tell where things are coming from, we can tell differences within a microsecond. So even more precise than a millisecond, than a thousandth of a second. So things starting at different times, where they're likely to be from different sources. And this should remind you of some Gestalt principles. And it is, so I'm hoping you picked those up and you're looking at them and you're thinking about them, but they're often a bit of a stretch to think about because of this fact that vision is more spatial and auditory is more timing based. I'm hoping you're looking at them though. So sometimes I get things like proximity in space, things being close to each other. Here it's things being close to each other in time. It's really starting at the same time. This is actually the reason I left the synchrony in there, because onset time works beautifully for that. I usually wait for my students to give me a couple, but since this is actually the first time I've done this, not in a synchronous/asynchronous class where I could play the game with the class still, even though everything else was videos. Second one I'm going to go through is the location sounds coming from different locations. We're going to perceptually separate those as well. And if there is movement, it's usually continuous, right? And I usually do this thing where I walk around the room. So as I'm walking around the room and I'm talking, that movement is continuous. It's not erratic. I don't know how to throw my voice across the room. If I could, that would be cool, but I don't. So if something's coming from a similar location or close by, we're going to put that as potentially at least more likely to be perceptually from the same source. And if that sound is moving, it's going to be in this continuous kind of movement, and I can hear that as the same source as well. So remind you of the Gestalt principle. It is particularly strange all by myself, but so here again, I feel like proximity is a really good one because of if we're from the more separated those locations are, the more easily we perceptually segregate or separate those timbres or sounds. Another nice one that people often yell out because that movement is continuous, they sometimes use or talk about good continuation, those smooth flowing lines. It's kind of like that. Again, you can a little bit, you have to stretch, but it works. We keep things together if they are similar in timbre and pitch, and we can segregate them more easily if they are more dissimilar or they are more different in timbre and pitch. So your authors bring up the differences between the flute and the trombone, where the timbres are really quite different from each other, and they are in different pitch ranges. And so they're very easy to tell apart. We also see that notes that are alternating rapidly between high and low tones are perceived as two separate melodies. So if their high tones are dissimilar or different from low tones, and if we're alternating those rapidly enough, what we'll do is this auditory stream segregation, where we will hear a melody in the high tones and a melody separately in the low tones. So musicians have been using this for centuries. This was really some of how the Baroque music became so much more complex and ornate that they used this, what they called implied polyphony, also sometimes called compound melodic line. The person who was a master at this was J.S. Bach. So he learned to create these. So he would alternate the low and high notes, and then if you play them fast enough, they separate out into these two separate melodies. So I'm going to play a bit of this Jesus Christus, unser Heiland, and I'm going to encourage you, if I can do this, and it works, I'm going to encourage you to listen. Let me get this going for a little bit. You can see it has some what do you call this? It has some visuals that might influence how you are interpreting the different melodies or separating out those different melodies. And so I am going to encourage you also to close your eyes just a couple of times as you're listening to this. You'll notice that when you open your eyes, your perception or your segregation, your interpretation kind of follows those visuals really nicely. Presumably, you're also following it nicely when your eyes are closed, but you can't tell because your eyes are closed. But I feel like it a little bit leads me into an interpretation, and I'm not sure how much part of that interpretation is because of the visuals. So I'll play this for just a little while, not the whole thing. Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and you'll notice. So these crossovers are really interesting to me. And again, I feel like I'm a little bit pushed, maybe, by the visuals that I am also following that same kind of line, and that they can cross over each other, which is kind of fascinating. But yeah, I could play with that for a while, but I'll stop it there, and I'm going to hopefully come back. Okay. So again, Baroque composers have been doing this they started doing this centuries ago, but we are psychologists, and so we need the evidence. This is research done in 1971 by Bregman and Campbell. And so time going along the x-axis, what the first figure shows is that it's going along a little bit more slowly. They would play a high and a low and a high and a low and a high and a low like that. And people interpreted that as a melody going high, low, kind of doing this bouncing around. We kind of don't like that, but if it's going slowly enough, that's how we interpret it. If they speed that up, so in B, you're seeing that time is going faster, and we speed that up. And instead, what happens now is the high stream segregates out, and they hear that as a melody. Our participants heard that as a melody, and the low stream segregates out. So it's a separate melody from the high stream, or the high notes. So we have psychological evidence for, again, what musicians have been using for centuries. And then there's also a great study by Diana Deutsch that, and she is one of the just preeminent researchers in the psychology of music. So she is a person who has perfect pitch, and I have ended up buying her book. I think it's called Psychology of Music, but I'll have to actually go home and look at what that's called. But I'm very excited about reading it. It is quite complicated and very, very long. It's kind of much more than I realized I was getting into when I bought it. But she is really quite amazing, and she's created some of these illusions. And one of the illusions is the scale illusion. So I'm going to play this. All of this is going to work better if you're wearing headphones. So I hope you're wearing headphones. I'm going to pull out of this for a minute and play some of these and ask you your experience, and just, you can think about it, since I can't hear you answering, since I'm on a video. It's much harder to play games with other people when it's a video. So I'm going to play the scale illusion. Again, if you don't have earphones on, pause, go get earphones. So I'll ask you what your experience was. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit. So you may have noticed that it sounded like you have in your left ear and I don't know exactly which direction this goes in because I put my headphones on in the middle, but so it would be a kind of an arpeggio, da 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 da, climbing up and going down, and then in the right ear it's gonna climb down and go up, da da. I can't do it that way. Sorry, it's not gonna happen. Okay, so that's what we perceive. But if we go back, that's the way I want to go. Let's just present what's happening only to the channel to the right ear. So let's listen to what was being played in the right ear. Okay, it's bouncing around, right? It's bouncing around between high and low. So if I can come back and hopefully show what she actually, what we end up hearing is down here in B. At the right ear, we hear the starting up at the high C and coming down B, A, G, A, B, C. So those notes that are close to each other, the high C was played first in the right ear. And so it kind of just pulls over those higher notes to the right ear. And we keep those notes that are more similar, we keep them together. So now actually, so what's happening if we're hearing, if we get this different locations, right? These are coming from different locations in our headphones. They're coming from different sides. They're coming to different ears, and yet we want to put those similar things together really badly. So that's kind of similarity trumping, right? Location. And the left ear, it's playing the low C, D, E, F, back down, E, D, C. And so that's what we end up hearing. But what she's actually playing is in the right ear, you get the high C, the low D, back up to A, down to F, back up to A, down to D, and up to the high C. And again, because you hear that high C at first in the right ear, you pull over the higher notes and that higher melody. You hear the higher melody, and those notes that are more similar get pulled together into a melody that segregates into itself. It is a very neat illusion, and you can't not hear it. So I know that this illusion exists, and yet I still hear it. We don't like that. We really kind of don't like that bouncing around and for things to be really dissimilar. I'm going to ask you if it reminds you of any Gestalt principles. Take my requisite pause, even though in a video. And these are not foolers. They're not designed to be tricks. So if you said similarity, hey, we have this Gestalt principle of similarity, right? If you remember, we put red things with red things. We separated those from the green things and put the green things with the green things. That's something we tend to do in vision as well. Something that is kind of related to this is this proximity in time. So sounds that occur in rapid succession tend to be produced by the same source, or we tend to perceive them as a melody, as belonging together as a melody. But remember that similarity is influencing us this as well. And actually, this was almost part of similarity, right? We were more likely to put together those similar things if they were if things were alternating rapidly. So this proximity in time, though, is important. And I'll go into these phantom melodies that are really kind of neat. This usually doesn't work very well as far as the sound levels. So I might be playing with the sound levels, and it might be, I'm either going to blast you out now or blast you out later, or something's going to be quiet. I don't know. You might have to play with your sound a little bit. But so let's look at or listen to a couple of these phantom melodies. I'm going to start by playing this, how do you say it? Frühlingsrauschen, something about spring, at 1/4 of the speed. So going more slowly. And you can count. So one of the things you want to do here, right, is count the melodies, that how many melodies do you hear? Okay, I did want to get a little tiny bit into where it gets a little bit louder and it's that it slightly changes, but the quarter speed is slow, right? And I don't know if you counted your melodies or if you heard very many melodies in that. This sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. Um, I heard two. And sometimes I hear more. Yeah, it just depends. I'm going to play one more and then I'm going to pause this video and start a new one. So here we are going to do this at full speed. So it's going to be quite a bit faster and we'll get into that louder part quite a bit more quickly. Okay, so now we're at about the same place. I went a teeny tiny bit farther into this one. As far as I wasn't counting my melodies very well because I was trying to figure out my timing. If I was about 2 minutes and 40 seconds into the other one, it was a quarter speed. About 40 seconds or so into this one, we'd be about the same place. So yeah, and I did get an extra melody somewhere in there, though I thought I heard three. But again, I was kind of doing math, so I'm not sure what happened with other people. Okay, I'm going to come back to this really briefly, and then I'll start a second video for this. So proximity and time, sounds that occur in rapid succession. So that second one was the example of how that music is supposed to be played, and then we end up hearing those high and low notes segregate out into different melodies, but we tend to hear that melody is coming from the same source, or we tend to perceive those separate melodies. When things are closer, we hear more melodies. I hope that makes sense, and it does. If I can go back, can I go back easily? Boop, boop, boop. So this whole idea that it's if it's played fast enough, there is a bit of repeat here, that it's changing because of the speed. But now we're talking about proximity and time as something else, even though it's related to that similarity, but it's the proximity and time. And so Gestalt principle, remind you of a Gestalt principle. And again, these aren't foolers. They are overlapping principles that people have found. And so if you said proximity, that works. You can say similarity again, because it's, again, the similar notes tend to be perceived as part of a single melody. And then the separate or the different notes or things that are more dissimilar go into separate melodies. Okay, I will stop that as part 1 of today's lecture, as I think it's been about 20 minutes or so. Now I'm going to